Okay, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining. This presentation is a lot of questions, so it's one of the Hornet's Nest themes as well as iRobot, thinking about the future. And it's about what I see as a potential false economy. And I've seen this already in marking the PG cert at my university. My name is Charlie Reis. I'm an educational developer at Xi'an Liverpool University, or XJTLU, in Suzhou, China. And we're seeing a lot more submissions that are just AI generated in assessments, and a lot more staff going to AI to generate feedback. And so when I talk about a false economy, I'm using the term to say, not that we're trying to save money early that's creating waste later, but that, we're marking things that students haven't written and we're not really giving them feedback or marking them adequately at times. This isn't all of us, but it just seems like this could be a trend that continues or grows, and it concerns me as an educator. So that's where this comes from. I am good. So I have a couple of provocations. I hope you can see them. But first one is, students' futures are already uncertain due to generative AI. And so they're much more likely to try and get high marks rather than do things like study, because they're very worried about the future. This might be particular to my context in China, but I think we all see it some ways. People do sort of infringe on academic integrity for a variety of reasons, as we know. But the pressures on students, I think, are growing, particularly with generative AI and how it does make the future uncertain for them, because nobody knows what the world of work is going to be. And then second provocation at the bottom there, part of our jobs will be using AIs to mark and give feedback. And what I'd like to do is see how we can incorporate that into a system of learning and teaching that's richer, rather than just automate ourselves out of practice. So, by the way, anytime anybody wants to chime in or respond, that's sort of how this was designed. So let's go on. This is the topics I'm going to cover are AI and teacher ethics, fairly briefly, responses to AI and incorporation strategies. And this is work I'm doing now and delivering on Monday with my university to try to get staff to incorporate AI into learning and teaching. And then thinking specifically about feedback generation and how AI generated feedback might fit into a feedback rich environment or a feedback ecosystem. And then raise questions about feedback literacy, AI literacy indeed, and student empowerment. And then talk a bit about chatbots and scalabilities. So this is mostly a list of questions because I feel like all of us are facing similar issues. So I don't want to say, oh, I'm the expert. It's just something I've been working on. I can see in our attendance list, Peter's here. I think he and I have been speaking at some events at the together. So hopefully this will be more of a group effort than one person. Good. So let's start with pros and cons. And here you can see at the bottom, I'm already asking for input. So obviously using AI as an instructor for feedback, it's fast and it saves time. But AIs are fairly shallow. I don't think when I'm looking at either assessments given to me at master's level for staff on our PG cert or other things, AIs can really do academic work yet. And I know that they're developing, and if you can prompt very well, you can get better stuff. But because we're using a lot of large language models and they're trained on a lot of language, that language isn't really the voice of an expert. It's the voice of everyone. And so it might be fast, but it's insufficient, I think. And then, what we do see is when people use AIs to create, it looks grammatical. So it might walk like a duck, but it doesn't really talk like a duck. It can have bad or offensive content, and it's trained on imperfect data. And again, if you do something very specific, an AI is not going to really respond. And a trend I've noticed, having just marked our PG cert, was asking people to reflect on the UK PSF. I got this very banal, very general language about the UK PSF. with exactly no attention to dimensions. And I'm suspecting that's because people were using AIs, because I don't think an AI would be aware of that. And as Anja's saying in the chat, it also introduces ethical bias, racial bias, I would add to that, gender bias, that kind of thing. So you're exactly right, Anja. And then, you know, one of the pros also, I don't know if it's a pro or an issue, but we see lots of professionals using this in the real world, mostly because we hear horror stories about it. But every business person I know in my town tells me how they're doing more and extending their business practice using artificial intelligence. But our students, you know, they're not paying for a result the way a business client might be in some ways. They're also paying for an expert. So I think in some sense, using these tools might devalue the user, which would be us. And I'd love to hear different ideas about that. And then the fourth one down, AI is the future. I have a question mark for the con. It might not always be accessible in the future. All of you, I'm sure, are aware, AIs are just becoming ubiquitous. And so I think it's a wave that's already crashed, and we don't know how deep this water is yet, but it seems quite deep. Everything these days is becoming more and more integrated with sort of machine learning or artificial intelligence as we use it generally. So that's that. And then I also think, you know, we have this tool. It does raise privacy issues for students. When I hear about staff putting student work into particularly Chat GPT, I get a bit concerned because we don't then protect the privacy of their assessment. So any comment on that from all of you? Please turn on your mic or use the chat.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some really interesting points raised. I was wondering, I use AI, you know, a reasonable amount. Sometimes I feel it makes me more valuable than less valuable because I'm able to put things better, think about things I hadn't thought about. I mean, obviously, it's the start, but it's not the end point of any piece of work. It's the very, very start, and it's really, for me, an ideas generator.
That's great. What I would say, Paulo, is that's probably because you're good at judging. And I'm not sure our students, or at least mine, are always in that position. But yeah, I mean, I think maybe playing with these tools as a starting point is where we want people to be using this in education. And that's certainly about the next thing I'm going to say. However, what I worry will be lost with all this, at least at my university, push to get everything AI enhanced, as we are saying, is where does the critical judgment growth and the learning that we want students to have come in? And I'm hoping it's with, as you mentioned, Paulo, the starting point for generating ideas that you would then judge. So much more like a digital critical friend or something like this. But that means, you know, we have to train students to use it. And again, who knows how they're going to use it. I'm sure circumstance will dictate lots of different uses.
Yeah. There's a comment. There's a comment in the chat from Peter Hartley about the issues around the monetization of AI, which is something that we're beginning to see with different, you know, I just wondered if you'd like to comment on that in terms of the general piece.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, the more powerful these tools get and the more, you know, you have to pay for the elite versions, the wider the digital divide, as we call it, will get. And, you know, I'm in China, so legally at the university, we have a subscription to Chat GPT, although it's very heavily monitored and redacted in some ways. For example, you can't put in. So I'm going to skip the ethics part. I assume you talked about some of this, hearing the last of it. Let me go to common strategies for generative AI integration. And this picks up on the last thing I heard Paulo and then Peter talking about, or maybe more Paulo. and this is what we're doing with all staff on Monday. So if we're thinking about feedback, we want people to be using it to make ideas. So things like brainstorming, getting feedback on things that they themselves have created. And I think that's where it can get really rich for them, as well as using sort of chat bots if they can be trained well. And one of the things I've noticed is there are a lot of AI-informed persona generators. So when I talk to people in international relations about, are they asking students to negotiate policy positions in a region of the world? Well, if those world leaders are one of these personas, they can get talking points and think about what works, what doesn't work from these AIs. And frankly, that might work not just with the persona generation, but with any large language model. So I'm seeing lots of possibility there, and we're seeing, with the sort of spread of people making specific apps to do things using largely ChatGPT, but other large language models as well, a real flourishing of different resources. And there are so many, it's happening so fast that if you look at number 4 there, it starts with co-creation. I would really love to get students involved in undoing the sort of student teacher dyad by having them bring to the educational environment lots of stuff. So they can either make revision materials, which a lot of students at our school are already doing, personalizing their own learning. So let them learn how to take on their own UDL concerns, not because we shouldn't be doing this as well, but just to get them more involved in the learning process and adding value to it themselves, and also helping with peer assessment. So I think also, telling someone, oh, you can make revision materials for yourself is great, but if they're making them for their peers and their peers are giving them feedback, that's even greater. So using the power of these generative tools to get students working together and talking, I think makes a lot of sense. And then to extend that, we have a lot of people that use case studies. So they can make cases, extend cases, branch scenarios, create multimedia for things really, really easily. And that's another way I think we're going to see a lot of impact from generative AI is the use of media in what was traditionally text-based, because students can do so much more so quickly and so creatively. I think this is probably going to be involved in a lot of engagement strategies. So that's number 6. And then, when I look at people doing repeated promptings, I wonder how much of that is a version of study, because I know I was trying to make a bunch of images. I might show them to you later about an old philosophical text from China called the Zhuangzi. And it took me forever to get the images to close to what I wanted because of the bias in AI, or just that it wasn't trained on data that looks like Warring States period China. So it helped me review again and again and again what I was doing in the context. So for a student doing that, they might be learning by repeated attempts to prompt. And I think we have to investigate both, do students have the literacy? Do staff have the literacy? And does this actually meet the level of learning outcomes that we want? And then, of course, Paolo mentioned earlier, it's a great starting point. I also think it's a great finishing point. And that's number 8, is that polishing things. We ask students to use polishing tools now anyway, even Microsoft Word spell check. So why wouldn't they do this with AIs? And I've already talked about UDL. And this isn't just with text. It also works, of course, with coding and other things. And I heard, Janet, you mentioning earlier, artists at your university. At our university, certainly the artists and architects are thinking a lot about images and how they fit into what students are doing, particularly if they're already doing modeling, this type of thing. Then I think, and more specific to feedback, if students put their own work into an AI, it can give them valuable insights on the patterns, the same way we would have, sort of linguistic computers looking at patterns and usages and things like that. And large language models are just predictive. So they could see, what are the patterns in student writing, and allow students to maybe get more organized, to write better, and see where their errors are or where things could be strengthened. So that could be an interesting use as well of feedback. And that also applies not only to student work, but to primary sources or sources. Putting something into a computer and getting data about structures and patterns can help appreciate it in new and different ways. And then finally, we're worried about students' futures. They're worried about their future with AI. So I think involving industry into student learning and looking at what they can do makes a lot of sense, as long as it doesn't completely disrupt our person or what our stated learning outcomes are. So ideas for practice, and this I wanted to throw in. I'm hoping we are striving for feedback-rich environments where there's multiple sources of information and students are seeing them as things they can use. So they feel the richness of, oh, I can use these AI tools. I can speak to my classmates. I can use the internet, which is now AI enabled, and talk to my teachers about it. And that's what we're aiming for, I think. And I think they have a clear place in some sense of contributing to a feedback-rich environment. The literature, and by that I mean blogs, generally, mostly are saying this is good for formative work, but they say, oh, it's unethical to use this for summative. I'm not sure I agree at all. As long as students admit they're using it and can defend what they're doing, I have no problem with it. My issue there is we have a lot of staff at my university saying, well, we'd love to go to a Viva style sort of mode of assessment where people are presenting, so they have to spontaneously respond to questions. But we have so many students that's completely untenable. So I'm wondering about what we're going to do there. But yeah, I think we're going to ask students to do more and more differently with these and use them to hopefully create more professional looking things and maybe more advanced things. So again, more on feedback rich. You can see my fish there. What do you guys think a feedback rich environment is? And I'd like you to please either tell me by voice, because I can't see the chat. I had to join from a browser window.
Would you like people just to put something in the chat and then I can so I can relay that to you, or would you just
great,
prefer
Janet.
people to just pipe
that would
up?
be fine. Or just pipe up. I'm fine with either.
Yeah, okay. I'll keep an eye on the chat then. So,
I mean, just to kick that discussion off, Charlie.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the main problems I think with students at the moment is that the delay in getting feedback to them, and in fact, they don't get all that much when you think about the number of assignments they might do over a semester. It's not too surprising that students don't really respond to it, and also that as soon as they've done one assignment, they're on to the next, and there's no kind of continuity, and there's no kind of long-term feedback into how they're developing. Another thing that I argued with in my previous institutions is that feedback just disappears into a black hole. It's never kind of put together and sorted out, and you never get that sort of sense of how is a student doing over assignments. I'm surprised that, well, I know there's been a couple of experiments trying to collate feedback in a better way and give a more consistent source of feedback, but I would have thought that some use of AI that also ties in with the whole kind of student database that we have would be a real kind of step forward.
Yeah, absolutely. So that, I mean, the AI might be consistent, although not 100% because it is generating every time. But if it's trained on a consistent model, so the data that's used, it would give fairly good feedback. We could also coach students to say, please compare this work with my former work. They could enter both. And that way they could get much more immediate feedback and have some correlation and consistency. I think this is probably work that has to be done maybe by a coder to develop an app, but I think it's a great idea, Peter.
Yeah.
Paolo's got his hand up. So
yeah.
I'm going to come straight in here with perhaps, I don't know. I don't like the term feedback. I think it's kind of from engineering, kind of it's quite mechanical. It's feedback. It's also audio feedback, noisy. It also has the sense that my work that I've produced as a student is only there for the lecturer and the authoritative figure to tell me how far along the road I am. But actually, I might be along a different road and wanting to be going on a different road. And I think that's very important for curricula to develop, because I think curricula and disciplines, get stuck with this sort of people at the front taking us forward and repeat, and the whole thing repeat and repeating people similar to themselves with this. You need to do it like this. I'm giving you feedback. The only way to do it right is through this feedback, which is very mechanical. And I don't particularly like even the term humanistic, but sort of like natural growth. So I'm not a great fan of the feedback. But so the alternative is more of a collaborative, a feedback rich environment. If in the feedback way that, I might change the term, is a collaborative environment with input from peers, possibly people in other years of study, opportunities for me to explore my expertise and to share my expertise as a student, also to be led by academic who has much expertise in their field. It's really important that they are inputting massively to the feedback environment, but they're not the only people, and there's just more. Yes, so feedback is a sort of I think a rich environment for learning is one of growth, and sometimes feedback can be constraining.
I love everything you said. So do you have a specific term you would put on that, or are you looking for that?
That's a good point. Yes, I should do, shouldn't I? Yeah, it's an idea. I mean, it's in development, really. I have explored it in sort of, I think, a couple of papers a bit, but yeah, I think I need to bring it out a bit more.
Yeah. Both you and Peter identify really salient points of that. Feedback disappears; it goes into a black hole. It's not valued because it's not delivered well. And again, if it's just from teacher to student, student doesn't have much agency, and we don't know what, as you said, path they're on. So go ahead.
Have you seen some recent work by David Nichol?
Yes.
Hello. Talking about getting students to compare their work with a whole variety of other sources. Because that, again, I think that would fit in more with the direction that Paolo's recommending. Although I would argue with Paolo about definitions of feedback, but that would take us into a whole new different conversation.
Yeah, I agree. So sort of comparative uses, and I also think we give feedback and then we don't do anything with it, and so it seems like it's a dead thing. And I think having it be part of, and I really dislike the term ecosystem, but an ecosystem or a feedback rich environment where there's lots of nutrients really for learning and growth is how I would see it better. And I think all this disruption, whether it's COVID and skilling up towards being able to do things multimodally or at distance, or AI and thinking about different things, I hope are sort of envelopes for better practice. And I know it'll be uneven, but yeah, I think this is a chance for people to, in some sense, get out of the way and let students learn. And it's by giving them agency. And part of the agency is that they'll be able to use these valuable tools, but it's also about seeing themselves and us seeing us and them differently. And I think actually, Paolo, you did a nice job of describing that.
So, Charlie, there's a couple of really nice comments in the chat that maybe actually, Tracy, you've made a really interesting comment around your work with working in with in-service teachers. Do you want to kind of just vocalize that comment?
Yeah, sure. So I kind of do what can be a fairly unpopular job, but over the years I've noticed that as I'm going down the corridor, less and less colleagues jump into the toilet as they see me. It's my kind of indicator as an academic developer on how much I'm annoying people. And since I've kind of made that switch to peer review, just the amount of energy within the room, or it's online, just increases. And really my role just becomes one of, have you thought about a different framing for that? How could you make it more targeted so that your colleague knows what to do? We're all busy, so we can I can kind of input in that way. But yeah, so for me, the rich feedback environment is kind of going with the expertise of the people that you're working with. And if it's first year students, you're probably teaching a little bit more how to feedback. But by the time you're getting to a place where you're kind of creating agents of change in some way or format, then peer review has to be at the center of what you're doing, in my view. But as I said, the only evidence I've got is less and less people peeling off to the toilet as they see me along the corridor. So
I agree, Tracy. I recently was in a 3-day session where I was the student, and I found it so disempowering, just uncomfortable. Yeah. So I think more equity and agency with both maybe our students who are undergraduates, as well as if we deal with staff at university staff. And you're right to pinpoint that expertise. And I began talking about how AIs are shallow and they don't encapsulate the expertise. So I think there's a lot of room still for the voice, and maybe we're thinking a little bit differently about what's happening or when the instructor as the sort of subject expert comes in. I don't know if it's at the end, if it's consistent through the whole thing, depending on time and numbers of students, but there should be more.
You wonder whether there's a possible future in, do you know Mike Sharple's work, Charlie?
I'm not sure.
He's turned one of his books into a GPT, on Chat GPT Plus. So maybe there's a potential future there whereby if a member of staff has written what they consider to be the right textbook, maybe that becomes one of the samples that Chat GPT uses.
Yeah, that would be excellent. I mean, I'm wondering also about the just feasibility of these local models of chatbots, or I guess plugins, so that they do pretty much what an instructor wants and don't do something else. That makes a lot of sense. However, one of the great things about AI or levels of abstraction, the further you get away from coding language or the sort of actual physics or hardware of a computer, is we can use natural language. And when we think about feedback, I think, with this narrative of authenticity, and I think, or lately I've been thinking about the work of Jen MacArthur and how when we talk about authenticity, we're defining it for students rather than letting them define it, which certainly seems problematic. So the natural language power of an AI, if it can do that, to be able to interact with a student in a way that the student can guide and the student is comfortable with, might be great for learning. Early in my career, I was teaching in a very, very bad university or college, actually, in Brooklyn, New York. And it didn't have aspirations to be the greatest. It had aspirations to do exactly what it did, which is serve the local community. But, learning there was much more effective when we were dealing with what students wanted to do. We were still learning and meeting outcomes, but we changed all the models. We changed our ethos so that people were comfortable. So they were spoken to in a way that they were used to or didn't feel like was exclusionary. And I'm wondering if using like the personas or natural language powers of generative AI can help with this as well.
Yeah.
Okay. Actually, both Paulo, Peter, and Tracy, you've sort of foreseen where I was going, so I'm going to move ahead a little more rapidly. So I'm going to skip this one. But when we're asking students to think about feedback literacy or staff to think about student feedback literacy, it gets very complex very, very quickly. And that's really the point of me showing you this diagram. There's so much. And then if we're talking about feedback literacy and digital literacy with AI, it's also, yet another set of burdens. So I'm concerned about both things. And I think we need to find a way forward that also considers staff because, Tracy, some people do hide in the bathroom when I walk down the hall, but I generally see myself as an advocate for staff, and hopefully they see that too. So when we try to provide solutions, we're not just adding yet another thing to their workload, which a lot of people are saying, oh, this AI is doing that as well.
Yeah. I hear you.
Yeah.
It's never going to be you can't be trying to win points, but you can be looking for when you're actively disengaging.
Yeah. So when I think about AI and feedback, and this is nothing new. So, we want to just make environments richer. And I guess we're getting a little simpler now in our conversation. So, we've seen the phrase critical friend, digital devil's advocate. We want them to be interacting so that they're revising or studying, so that they're learning. And whether they're doing this in conversation with their mates or, by themselves, but with a computer that can answer them, those are all versions of study. And hopefully we have lots of them. And then, so thinking about the typology of feedback, I think we could put generative AI in a few places. And I'm interested to, does anybody else have an opinion here where we would put it? With thinking about this continuum now, based on what Paula said about 5 minutes ago, I would think, let's let students use it the way they want to use it to some extent. And yes, we're there for guidance because we have gone through hopefully what they're learning and we know what the learning outcomes are that will be assessed. But, let students play with things so that they get the things that they need or want at that time. And now I want to move to criticality, because this is something that I think hasn't been answered to my satisfaction. Peter mentioned that, he asked AI for an image of beauty and he got something that was basically a Barbie. We know AIs can be terrible. We know they hallucinate, they can be sexist, racist, everything else. Does that mean that we'll be able to train students to look at these products and critically engage? And I think that probably depends on the instructor. If the instructors are literate enough and take the time to, with students, explore this, it'll happen. If they just throw it in as a tool because they're mandated to, it won't happen. But one of the things that strikes me is that's the bottom question here. I keep hearing stories of, people getting in trouble professionally because they relied on generative AI, whether it's, fake cases in a legal brief or something else. Yet every business person I know is using it all the time, but they're checking the results. So I think it's about practice. And let me move on really quickly to a couple of things. So, we're as a sector or as a world thinking about AI literacies now. And what I'm being told by senior management in my university is, we want to grow the competencies that will allow students to enter the workplace, very specifically through learning with us, because we see that the world is changing with AI. So when I talk to subject academics, I say, is this your responsibility to ensure to teach it? And a lot of them say yes, and then a lot of them also say no. They don't, say you're in urban planning and design, you don't necessarily want to shift assessments to deal with AI or worry about that as much as teaching about the core concepts. So I think we're going to see, this work itself out happily or unhappily. And then some thoughts. We've covered this, but students benefit from multiple forms of feedback. If we don't call it feedback, we can call it a collaborative environment for learning, where there's lots of different sources of information, which I hope satisfies Paulo. When we think about authenticity, it should be more valuable to students as they think of the world and themselves, not as we imagine their futures. I don't particularly love the phrase the ivory tower, but when I try to imagine students' futures at work, it's much like my past at work. So I don't know what they're going to be doing. And then thinking about assessment generally, if students can cheat on the essay or generate the image, let's not revert to really basic forms of assessment. Let's not, again, lose the richness we have in varieties of assessment. Let's explore how we can do things that are more fun and cooler. And, thinking about what Peter said about Barbie, I love playing with these tools too. And I find it really fun to play with an AI, to get it to do different things. And hopefully we can get that into learning, because if people want to learn, they're much more likely to engage in the ways that, we want them to. They're much more likely to feel like they belong. So making things more interesting, because we can very easily generate a lot of different content in a lot of modes and medias now, I think can really help education. And then finally, of course, if we patchwork things, Peter mentioned feedback going into a hole and having no consistency. So that ought to be patchwork too. But also what we're asking students to do should be linked to that. And that might help a lot with a richer environment that's AI informed with feedback. And then some final provocations. Do you think we have a duty to incorporate these tools, or the opposite? Do we have a duty to also get them to learn without them? And I'm going to shut up and hope that you answer.
I would say yes to the first bullet, certainly, because it's going to have so much impact on their future career. But I think we have to be very critical of it. And it's getting that. So we have to teach students to use it and to know about it. And I think perhaps what's missing is that second part, knowing about how it works and why it does the things it does.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, who has time at universities? Usually students. So I don't know why we're not asking them to lead, like find out about this and tell us. Peter, what do you think about the inverse?
Well, it depends. I don't think we have a duty. Well, it depends on the context. I think we should. I think it goes back to a point that was made earlier, that, for example, if you are working in art and design, you still need some of the basic craft skills in order to make best use of Gen AI, which is kind of an ironic twist there. So I think there are some cases where, using Gen AI is actually counterproductive, both from the student point of view and the staff point of view. Yeah,
I think also for some professional accreditations, there's a SAT exam with an essay. So students need to still gain those skills as well. But it was exactly people in design that mentioned this to me, that they're actually going back to pencils and papers because people can't make judgments if they haven't gone through the process. And then the bullet number 3 down there, do you think, designing for integrity is always great, but I also wonder, student access to the internet is generally irrelevant these days. I think most students have that, at least in most of the contexts we deal with. AI will become like this, I think.
I think so. Although I think there's a different ball game. It goes back to points made earlier about the different levels now of Gen AI, and the fact that, you know, the companies like OpenAI are increasingly trying to make a bigger gap between the free version and the paid version, in order to hook you in and then make you buy the paid version.
Yeah, I wonder if this is going to happen and we have a bunch of people that are super productive and the other people don't have access to quality work. What like, that seems like a global issue. And I don't have a good answer for it, but yeah, I think we're seeing this trend. And again, I close at the bottom there with the idea of a false economy. It is something I worry about. But then when I'm giving feedback, I always think of myself as an algorithm, because I know what I'm looking for. I know what the patterns are in the work I'm looking at. So I don't know how far away AI is. And given our discussion, I want to, yes, go ahead.
Sorry, Paolo has his hand up.
Yeah, I know
Okay.
time's running out.
Yeah, and we've
just-
got like 3 minutes.
I'm going to try. Okay, just very quick. Just when I think it's I think we need to think about essay questions or exam questions or whatever they are, and requiring some sort of personal input. So the AI can really only ever operate as an idea generator. As a student, I remember not knowing how to get started, and AI would have helped me be more confident about making assertions. So if it was talking about Derrida or Foucault or something like that, we're not really sure what they're saying, but it would give me more confidence in what they were saying. And finally, just with art, I think, and that thing, and I sometimes wonder if it's the final product that artists are producing, or actually in its expression of self. And if it's an expression of self, it makes very little sense for it to be AI generated anyway, because it means nothing. I think art for me should be an expression of humanness, and that's where the value of art is.
That's interesting. I think, though, you know, just taking the title of Dewey's book, Art as Experience, you can, you know, we talk about found art all the time, or incidental art. And so I think it just depends on how your mode of comportment, how you're engaging with something. But the idea that, you know, we would say, oh, this AI is a genius, look at how brilliantly it painted the Sistine Chapel ceiling. Yeah, we're not going to do that. It's an interesting question, Paulo. I want to share with you guys one last thing, and this is something I worked out with a couple of people at my university to talk to staff about integrating AI into learning. So I said this earlier, but you know, the more advanced version of this would be using generative AI to undo traditional roles. So students are really engaged in creating, and they're using very powerful tools to collaborate with everyone to do something more interesting and hopefully to them more important. And this would, again, require lots of feedback in a rich environment. And then intermediately, so it's a leveler at the advanced stage. Intermediately, we would call it more of an extender to enhance modules. So students are creating some stuff, but it's much more instructor-led. So if we're talking, say, about, I don't know, a certain practice, they could create case studies based on specifications from the teacher or extend them, this type of thing, and then work to enhance the existing materials. And then really basic, I think, is what we were talking about a virtual buddy or a getting started point. But we want to, you know, start walking down this road to incorporate these tools in a way that makes sense for learning, not just for what our assessments were, you know, at the beginning of the academic year. Questions, comments?
Well, I'm afraid we're kind of to time, but we've had a great, and part of that is your issues around the tech. I think it put us out a bit, but we had a fantastic discussion. So thank you very much.